Good morning again. Let me invite Dr. Indermit Gill to join me here. Indermit really does not need an invitation to The Economist. He's a very well-known economist in the world. His formal title is Chief Economist and Senior Vice President. He's done many, many things in the world. He's a friend and known him for many years. People who study economics associate his name with the middle income trap, a term that he coined many years ago. To me, in his recent tenure at the World Bank, when he took over as the chief economist some 4 years ago, he has restored the bank's reputation as the gold standard on economic thinking, in writings, in his huge cadre of world-class economists for the best thinking on development economics, and his writings and his reputation, the World Bank's economic work, as writing as the very best work on economics. And Indermit has been very kind to come all the way from Washington non-stop to Abuja to be with us for 2 days, to talk to you this morning, to give the first keynote speech. And then tomorrow night, he'll get into the plane again to go back to Washington. Indermit, kindly come and talk to us about the subject. What is this animal called artificial intelligence and what it means for development of the world? Thank you, Indermit.
Do you want to sit there and then we
No,
both go
I'll
after?
sit there and then...
Whichever way you like.
Yeah, better, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So first, thank you, Harinder, for that very nice introduction. Thank you to the Central Bank of Nigeria for this wonderful venue. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa. And thank you, most of all, thank you all for being here. So I'll be brief so we can soon have lunch. I think everybody is waiting for lunch now, and so am I. So I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence for economic development. So I'm specifically not going to be talking about artificial intelligence in places like the United States and China. I'll be talking about what AI means for low-income countries and especially for emerging markets. Okay? The work I'm going to summarize today is from the next World Development Report that is on artificial intelligence. I think it's called The Promise of Artificial Intelligence. It's a long and detailed report, and I'm sure that I will not do it justice in my summary. Hey, thank you, Governor Cardoso. Now I'm suddenly nervous. Yeah. I was very relaxed. Hello? Yeah, good. Okay. But though I won't do the report, though I won't do this report, which is very carefully done, I won't do it justice, but it will be released next week. So I hope that I will encourage you in my remarks to take a look at it when it is. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you several slides. I don't know if you see it there. Do you guys have slides? Okay, there you go. So I'm going to show you a bunch of slides, but actually the messages are fairly simple. It's just three main points, and the important points that you really want to remember is optimism, the second one is adaptation, and then the third one is selectivity in policies. So the main points I'm going to tell you is that people in developing countries should be optimistic about the potential of AI to do good things in poor countries, in middle-income countries, and even in the newly industrialized countries. Okay? So while you hear a lot of noise about the bad things about AI, that it might lead to mass unemployment, that it will lead to machines taking over humanity, et cetera, that it'll lead to greater concentration, those might be true for some, for the large economies in which those debates are taking place, but those are not necessarily true in poorer and developing economies, and I'll show you some evidence on that one. The second is that while AI has many similarities with earlier transformational technologies, these are called general purpose technologies like steam power, like electricity, like computers, like the internet, and so on, there are two main differences. And the two main differences are important for countries to figure out what a good strategy is. So the first important difference is that AI is coming faster than previous technologies, which means that you don't have a lot of time to wait and then become wealthier or have enough resources, accumulate enough resources to spend on advancing these technologies, okay? It'll be too late, okay? The second part is that the second main difference is that AI is much more context-specific than previous technologies. Like a tractor or electricity and so on was pretty much the same anywhere. But AI is much more context-specific. What does that context specificity mean? It means that you can't just adopt it and use it, generally speaking. You have to adopt it and you have to adapt it as well. So these two things, so if you think of a three-pronged strategy, adopt, adapt, and advance, for AI, for developing economies, adaptation will be the big part of the strategy. It'll have to be because advancement is not possible and pure adoption is not effective, okay? Now, the third thing is that, but even adaptation is not that easy because it requires infrastructure, it requires skills, it requires all of these things. So you have to be selective in this. And basically, you have a choice between different types of AI. So there's generative AI, there's predictive AI, and there's agentic AI, right? So all of you know what predictive AI means. It basically forecasts what will happen. So for example, will Governor Cardoso immediately take seriously what I say and change monetary policy? Yes, okay. So I'm not going to say those two words again. Okay. The second one is generative AI, okay? And this builds on what is asked. So for example, you could ask, give me a summary of this session. That you're using generative AI. And then the third one is agentic AI. Because I told you that the World Development Report is going to come out next week, you can actually devise an agent that will tell you when that report comes out and send it to your email and summarize it for you, et cetera, et cetera. So that is agentic AI. And what we find is that a big part of what will yield the biggest returns in developing countries for which they have the capacity to implement and effectively do so is predictive AI. Okay? The second one is that there is a big advantage for AI in the improvement of the delivery of services. I'm talking about essential services like medical care, like education, like legal and judicial care, like agricultural extension, and so on. Now, these are bigger priorities in countries that are more agrarian, where you have many people who don't yet have these services and so on. So I'm describing a developing country like Nigeria or like India. So actually, the upside of AI technologies is also very, very great. But you have to be careful to see where are the returns highest in this one. And what we find through our work is that the highest are not in frontline generative AI. The highest returns are actually in back-end predictive AI. Those are things that developing economies actually have the capacity for. And the reason why I'm saying this is because they're already implementing these things. These are not pie-in-the-sky kind of predictions and so on about what works, what doesn't, okay? And now my colleague Kenan has told me that I spent too much time on the first slide, so I need to move on to the second one. Go ahead. Yeah, okay? The other thing, by the way, also, is that we are used to thinking about big investments being made in places like the US, in places like China, and so on. But that is not what is happening. That is not what is happening in developing economies. In developing economies, actually, a lot of the investments are much smaller. They're much more diffuse, okay? Now, there's an implication for this. If you're making big investments, if a company is making big investments, it has to ultimately show its investors that it's going to get this money back. How does it get this money back? In part, by efficiency improvements. And that often means getting rid of expensive workers. So it is absolutely reasonable for workers in places like the United States and China to be worried that their jobs are going to go. It is reasonable because these firms are making big investments. But that's not the case in most developing economies. In most developing economies, things are much smaller, okay? In most developing economies also, these technologies are likely to actually complement workers in small businesses, complement farmers in small farms and so on. They're far more likely to do that. Again, I'm not talking about conjectures, I'm talking about actual experience, and that's what we summarize in the report, okay? All right. Now, so here are the AI effects. I'm going to show you a few slides now. So the first one is there's widespread but misplaced pessimism. Tune it out. If you're a Nigerian, tune it out, okay? Because if you focus on this one, there is a danger that countries like Nigeria, countries like India and others will miss this industrial revolution, okay? And you have to remember, you have to just look around yourself and say, what happened when you missed the industrial revolution? You ended up being behind for 200 years. Can't risk it again, okay? All right. The other thing that you sort of see is that the world economy is not doing particularly well. Investment rates are declining, potential growth rates are declining, and so on. AI comes at a really good time. And I'll show you some estimates that AI has the potential for returning us to the levels of growth that we experienced before COVID. And actually, in the upside case, it'll actually return us to growth rates that we experienced in the 2000s. And remember, the 2000s were the golden age of economic development, okay? All right. So I'm going to show you a few slides. The first one is, if you look at this slide, you'll see that people in Europe and the Americas appear to be worried. They're much more likely to be worried about AI than excited about it. But what's really healthy is that you see in Asia and in Africa, people are more excited than worried about it. It is rational to be worried if you're a worker in an advanced economy, given the nature of the economy, given the nature of these investments and so on. It is also rational not to be more excited because the upside of AI for developing economies is massive, okay? Now, the other thing I want to tell you is growth rates. If you look at this, you actually see what has been happening to growth rates. So if you look at the world economy, it was growing at around 3.2% in the decade before COVID. And if you look at it for this year, we are predicting that it would grow at 2.5, okay? That's a big come down, right? If you look at advanced economies, that rate has gone from 2% to 1.5%. If you look at emerging markets and developing countries, that rate has gone from 5.2 to 3.6. By the way, we still have a problem here because take out the US from advanced economies, and that number goes from 1.5 to 0.9, 0.8. It's very low. Take out India and China from the emerging markets and developing economies, that number goes from 3.6 to 2.6, okay? So if So what will happen is that you miss out on this technology, and China and the US and perhaps India are going to do fine. They're the largest high-income country, the largest upper middle-income country, the largest lower middle-income country. They're going to do okay. The gap between them and other economies like Nigeria and South Africa will only grow. Okay? You can't miss this. Okay? Now, so what we did do, by the way, was we tried to estimate what are the returns from AI, right? And of course, naturally, AI is not estimated with the same precision as electricity and ICT. But roughly speaking, if you look at the boost, the productivity boost that you got from electricity, it was about 1 percentage point of GDP growth, okay? If you look at ICT, it was about half of that. If you look at AI, under reasonable scenarios, it'll be something in between. Okay? It could be on the upside, it could be as high as electricity. On the lower side, it could be low. But a lot of this, how much it actually leads to in terms of productivity improvements and so on, this is something that actually depends on policy choices. So this is not a given. Okay? So for that reason, what we say is that one should try one's hardest to actually take advantage of it. Now, here's another reason why one should be less pessimistic in developing economies, much more optimistic about it. The chart on the left shows you what share of the jobs are likely to be affected adversely by AI. That would be replaced, basically, by AI. If you look at that ratio, that's about 10% of jobs, about 1 in 10 jobs in the poorer economies. And it's more like more like 30, 40% in the case of upper income countries. So of course, those countries are actually rationally far more likely to see labor force displacement. You will not see the same displacement. You're not likely to see the same displacement in most developing countries which are still agrarian, which still depend a lot on small businesses and so on, okay? The other thing that you sort of say, well, but they depend on small businesses. Small businesses are not capable of actually using AI. All our evidence indicates that in developing countries, we don't see that much of a difference in how likely small businesses are to use AI as compared to large businesses. So actually, there isn't grounds for that pessimism. Okay? You should not think that small businesses, if you look at that, for example, on the right side, you actually see that those ratios are pretty much the same for small firms as well as large firms in developing countries. So one of the nice things you'll see in this WDR, in the World Development Report, is that a lot of this evidence is for developing countries, which generally you don't see. Those are not numbers on which a lot of debates are based. So in countries like Nigeria, this report should reset these debates. Okay? And you should debate based on these technology, on these numbers. Now, there aren't as many numbers for these countries as we would like, but this is something that can be fixed too, and we will fix this over time, because not only is this a policy report, it's also a research report. Okay, let me go on. So again, like I said, I'm not talking about possible things. I'm talking about things that are already happening. So in agriculture, for example, in the Indian state of Telangana, you're already seeing the productivity effects. In the case of Kenya, for example, you find that using predictive AI technologies, the judiciary has actually cut caseloads massively. I mean, this is a big deal in countries like Nigeria and countries like India and so on. These are huge caseloads, and it looks almost hopeless that it'll take decades to sort of thing. It might take decades without AI. With AI, it could take just years, okay, or even months. And then if you look at Bangladesh, for example, you find diagnostics and so on. These are not, again, like I say, these are not hypotheticals. These are actual numbers, okay? All right, so what are AI strategies? What should they be? I'm going to quickly show you 6 slides, and then I'll stop. So the first one is, as I said, adaptation has to be the biggest part of this. And it's essentially, this chart over here summarizes the structure of the World Development Report. It looks at what are the things that you need which is essentially capabilities, concentration, and complements. What are the strategies? Adopt, adapt, advance. And like I said, the biggest part would be adaptation for most countries. And then if you look at the development effects, you actually see they're economic, they're social, and they're political. These need to be managed. And then the role of governments, and because we sort of spend a lot of time on this one, there are 3 chapters. First, governments as enablers of AI, governments as users of AI, and governments as regulators of AI. And I'll just quickly give you a snapshot of the findings, okay? So that's the part over there. So this, by the way, the chart on the right looks at World Bank projects. So we actually look to see what are government projects procuring in terms of AI and so on. So whenever we could get the numbers, that's what we did. And that's what I meant by saying predictive AI in back-end use, that's what seems to come out the most. That's what's most in demand, okay? All right. And so here is a comparison, by the way, of firms in the US as compared to firms in surveyed low and middle-income countries especially, and you find many more similarities between these firms rather than, especially the smaller firms. Okay. This part basically indicates that, so a lot of what I'm telling you is based on a small set of rigorous evaluations and a lot of other evidence which is more circumstantial, but we checked it to make sure that we are not getting ahead of the evidence here. But what we sort of find is that there is a need for much better analysis of AI-related interventions. This is underway too, by the way. This is underway at the World Bank. It is underway in places like Nigeria, India, and so on. And we'll be informed a lot more. The next one, there's always this concern that people have saying, well, if Nigeria depends on US technologies or on Chinese technologies, there could come a point where Nigeria ends up being held hostage, okay? Because the US might actually deny these technologies, China might deny these technologies. So, which means that now you have a choice. You either pray, which is not good policy. The second one is to sort of say, okay, you know what, I'm going to aim for sovereignty myself. I'm going to invest a lot. Most countries don't have the money to compete with the US and China. Actually, no country has enough money to compete with US and China. So the next one is actually, and this is the mainstay of policies in places like India and so on, someone will know more. But basically, what they're looking for is interoperability, so that you can use Chinese technologies, you can use US technologies, you can use your own indigenous technologies and all too. Interoperability is a far more practical and a far more effective strategy for most middle powers, okay? You don't, right? Okay, now, and by the way, pretty much every country is a middle power other than the US and China. So here you sort of see is that don't obsess too much with mandatory standards. Don't try to say, okay, how do I make sure that AI does not lead to adverse political impacts or social impacts and so on? How can I do that through government fiat? And last year we did a World Development Report on standards, and which basically indicated successful standard setting actually starts, has a foundation of industry-led standards. So basically governments have to create the conditions in which it makes sense for industry to get together and set voluntary standards. And that is happening already, okay? And then, on top of that, if you find that industry cannot solve these problems themselves and so on, then you think about mandatory standards. So here again, and by the way, it's far easier to help industry arrive at voluntary standards that they self-enforce rather than come up with mandatory standards which you then have to enforce, and you often don't have the quality infrastructure to actually do so, okay? Now, so what's the World Bank group trying to do? So essentially what we have is a three-pronged thing, which is scale small AI, okay? Call this AI in a suitcase, or call this AI that can work with intermittent internet access, with not that much electricity, et cetera, et cetera. That's not enough, though. You have to invest in country capacity, and that's not enough either. You also have to sort of continue to build AI foundations. For a country like Nigeria, this is all three of these are equally important. I could imagine some smaller economies that can do with just one and two, but for a big economy, a big ambitious economy like Nigeria, you have to do all three. Okay? Once again, as I said, what we find in our World Bank Group operations that you already see in the case of education, in the case of agriculture, in the case of legal judicial services, and a whole lot of other things, you already see very promising applications of these things. So let me conclude with this summary again. AI impacts are not the same as in advanced economies. Don't extrapolate from their debates about what are the dangers and what are the opportunities in economies like Nigeria, in economies like Ghana, like Mali, etc. The second one is because AI technologies are even more context-specific than previous GPTs, it's not going to be just simply adopt. And you have too short time horizons or too much urgency to think about waiting to have enough resources to advance the technologies. Adaptation has to be a big part of it. This does not, for a big country, it doesn't rule out investing in advancing some technologies and all too, but in general, adaptation has to be the mainstay of it. And then finally, as I sort of said, is that the AI strategies require making some choices. You have a choice between generative, predictive, and agentic. Generally, predictive AI is going to lead to the greatest cost benefit. Then you have a choice between adoption, adaptation, advancement. Again, adaptation is the most sensible, the most feasible thing. You can be unregulated, or you can have voluntary industry-led regulations, or you can have mandatory government-determined regulations. Go for the middle one. And then you can be passive, or you can invest in interoperability, or you can try for AI sovereignty. Go for the middle one. And then finally, you can not invest in AI because you feel like this is not something that's beyond you, it's too mysterious. Or you can have small, diffuse investments, or you can have large, concentrated investment. Go for the middle one again. Okay? I'll stop here, and we can take some questions.